Church, we're glad that you're here this morning, and I don't know about you, but I am desperate for sports and entertainment, and I'm obviously not the only one. Based on what we just saw, there's lots of people desperate for sports and entertainment and that sort of thing. And I think beyond that, though, even as some of the sportscasters in the world or entertainers in that realm, they're just desperate for purpose too. And as we continue to navigate the era we're living in, I think many of us are desperate for purpose. And as we look around our world and try to figure out what does purpose look like, how do we figure all of that out, we get to a place where many of us can end up with some pretty negative thinking. And that's what we're going to talk about today as we continue in our series called Asking for a Friend. And so we surveyed our congregation of you, and we asked and received hundreds of questions, spiritual questions, questions around different subjects. And some of the main subjects we've got questions about are the ones we're addressing and trying to address as much of them as we can over this month or so that we're in the series. And so we talked about anxiety a few weeks ago. We talked about relationships last weekend. And this weekend, we're going to talk about depression. Now, before you tune out, like maybe I would have a few years ago and said, well, I don't deal with depression. I don't think it's real. I want to encourage you to lean in and engage, because you may not be there now, but you might need the information for yourself one day, or for someone you love or care about, or for another follower of Jesus. So let's dive into a weird kind of subject of depressions. Why don't we talk about depression? It probably feels that way for many of us, that we don't talk about depression with so many people going through it. And people don't like to talk about their depression. And we live in a time where it's almost impossible. It's really ever present, the idea of depression and anxiety, either or both. And so today, we're going to understand that there's a difference between depression and depressive thoughts. Those are two very different things. And so here's what we're going to do. I want to kind of put us all on the same page by understanding what depression is. And then I want us to look into a story in the scripture that I believe speaks strongly to depression and helps us best understand where we could be as a people, as a person who's a follower of Jesus, and having a conversation around depression. And then I want to share with you what might surprise some of you of a personal experience and a personal struggle that I've had with this very subject. And so let's begin with here. What is depression? Well, depression is a mental condition characterized by feelings of despair and dejection, typically also with feelings of inadequacy and guilt, or often accompanied by a lack of energy and disturbance in appetite or sleep. And so you may look at this list of things: despair, dejection, inadequacy, guilt, energy, disturbance, appetite, sleep, right? You might look at that list and think, holy cow, I have some of those things. Am I depressed? Well, remember, we're going to identify there's a big difference between depression and depressive thoughts, okay? And so some of the main questions we get around this, or we've gotten through the series, is it sinful? Can I take medication? Should I feel shame if I've had depression? And here, let me give you a couple of quick answers before we look into the Bible's answer. And the first thing is this: if you're struggling with depression, you want to know if it's sinful, it really depends on why you're depressed. Are you in a depressive state, or having depressive thoughts, or living a life just consumed with depression because of sin, because of something you've done to offend God? Or are you there because of some sort of chemical issue, or maybe a psychological issue, or you're dealing with mental health? Like, if it depends what side of the spectrum. So it's not as easy as some may want to make it, but sometimes it's a product of brokenness in people, and sometimes it's a result of sin. And we shouldn't feel this shame. Shame just isn't helpful in this process. When we sin, we feel guilty. When we go through the process of experiencing other people's sin, we feel resentment. And neither of those are particularly helpful to moving us forward. And just like when we talked about anxiety, medication can be the most spiritual way to deal with it. So, as Christians, we're not going to look down on people who are dealing with depression, who are dealing with this issue. We're going to look at them and love them just like we would anybody with any other health issue. So how do we combat depression? How do we deal with it? How do we deal with this thing that maybe keeps coming back in your life? How do I get through it? How do I, as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, how do I live this out? What are some Bible verses or stories that give us some insight on what depression is? And so today, I want to tell you one of my favorite stories. It's my wife's favorite story in the Bible, and it's the story of Elijah. And you may know some of the story of Elijah. It's very exciting, lots of different cool things, but what we're going to find as we look at this story is that in order to combat depression, it starts with knowing where it comes from. And so let's start there. Where does depression come from? We're going to find that difficulty can create depression in our life. And all of us have been through difficult circumstances. All of us are living through that right now. And so did Elijah. But it's not as obvious in his life, and it may not be as obvious from the outside in yours. You see, Elijah had done a lot of things that he'd been asked to do by God. He was obedient. He was devoted. He was chosen to do God's work. He did incredible things. And even in his obedience, he experienced hardship. And so the story is found in 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through about 13 or so is what we're going to look at. And just before we get to this part of the story, just before it, there's this giant standoff at Mount Carmel. Not Mount Caramel. That's a conversation you guys can have at lunch today if you're going to be a caramel person or a caramel person. But at Mount Carmel, there's no A in it. There's been this drought across the land for a number of years. And so the king, his name was Ahab, he wanted the drought gone. And so there was this argument about whose God was more powerful. Was it Baal or was it the king's, or was it God, the God that we serve today, the Israelites' God? And so you had the prophet of God, who was Elijah, and then you had 850 prophets of Baal. And so they have two bulls. They go on top of this mountain, 850 prophets on one side, Elijah on the other, and the rules laid out are do whatever it takes to get your God to call down fire from heaven. And so many of you may know the story. Baal is a no-show. God shows up. He consumes everything that Elijah had set up. In fact, throughout the day, the prophets of Baal constructed their altar of stone, and then they put on wood, and then they put on their bull, and they began praying and cutting themselves. And Elijah on the other side did the same thing. Took him the whole day to do it by himself, to find the stones, to put the wood on there, put the bull, and then he did something unique. He went out, climbed down the mountain, got some water, brought it up in jugs, poured it all over the place, and made the wood wet so that it wouldn't catch fire just by happenstance. Then he prayed. And when he prayed, God sent this fire from heaven. It consumed everything around it. It consumed the bull. It consumed the wood. It consumed the stone, the water, everything, and left just this. It was this incredible God moment in his life, in the life of Israel. It was amazing. And a couple of moments later, maybe a couple of hours or days later, the drought still going on, Elijah prays again, and he asks God, will you get rid of this drought? And he does. God allows rain. In a period of just a few days, a few hours, Elijah has gone from calling fire down from heaven to calling water down from heaven and showing the people of Israel how great God is. And you've probably had moments like that in your life. I know I have, where I felt like I got to participate in showing people how great God is. And at the height of the greatest thing that he'd been a part of, Elijah finds himself struggling with depression. So the story goes that Ahab, the king, he went home after this great experience. He told Jezebel, his wife, the queen, everything Elijah had done, including the way he killed the prophets. He didn't just destroy them and their God. He actually killed all the prophets of Baal. And so Jezebel sent this message to Elijah. May the gods strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I haven't killed you just as you've killed them. Elijah was afraid. He fled for his life. He is afraid of a queen when the God of the universe, at his beckoning, just sent fire and water to the earth. It's crazy, right? You start thinking about this. It says he went to Beersheba, a town in Judah. He left his servant there. Elijah believes he's done with ministry. It's over for him. He's leaving his servant behind. He's going alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. Could have been 20 miles he traveled in one day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. This is like a whiplash. Weeks, literally days after the greatest climactic event in his life, one of the greatest events in history, right? For the nation of Israel. They're looking at what God had done, and all of a sudden they want to die. I've had enough, Lord. He said, take my life, for I'm no better than my ancestors who've already died. And so he spends the entire day thinking, walking, assuming his ministry is over. His purpose is gone. His life is worthless. He's upset with God. He's looking at this situation saying, God, I did everything you asked me to do, and Jezebel intends to kill me. God, just get it over with. Let me die now. The situation is out of his control, and all he's left with is God. All he's left with is God. This difficult situation in his life created the opportunity for depression. The other thing that creates opportunity for depression in our lives are expectations. Expectations can create the opportunity. It can create depression in our lives pretty quickly. Elijah felt hopeless. He felt torn down. He wasn't the hero that he thought he would be. People weren't touting how great God was or how great his servant Elijah was. Whatever his expectations were of what may have happened, it's fair to say that death, wandering, and purposelessness were not part of the plan. My expectations, if they're dependent on other people, often set me up for disappointment, failure, and anger. I know that's true in my life. It was true in Elijah's life, and I know it's true in your life. Your expectations, when they're dependent on other people, often create disappointment and anger and even lead to depression. And a step further than that is when we expect things from God that are not in his plan for us, it leads us to the feeling of failure, disappointment, and anger. When we expect God to do something that he never told us he was going to do in our life, when we expect God, well, God, I can't believe that I'm economically disadvantaged right now. I can't believe that things are hard. God never promised that you were going to be the richest person to ever live, right? And we have this in our minds, right? When God doesn't bless our efforts, that we haven't consulted with him, it leads us into this mismatched expectations and can lead us towards a depression that maybe draws us back to who God is. But as we continue in the story, we find there's a simple solution. It's a very simple solution. That simple doesn't mean easy. Simple means painstakingly challenging in this scenario, but it's still simple. It's not complex. It's not complicated. Let's look at what happens in Elijah. So he lays down to sleep under this broom tree. And while he was sleeping, an angel touched him and woke him up. Out by himself, middle of the wilderness, under a tree, the angel says, get up and eat. So he looks around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on a hot stone and a jar of water. I mean, imagine waking up, there's a jar of water that wasn't there before, and there is a stone with bread on it for me to eat, and there's nothing better than warm bread. We all know that, right? That's why every restaurant on the planet gives it to you when you show up. And so, but it's not just bread, but warm bread. And so it says he ate and he drank, and then he went and lay down again. And then the angel of the Lord came and touched him and said, get up, go eat some more, or the journey ahead of you will be too much. And so he got up, he ate, he drank, and the food gave him enough strength to travel 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai, which was a really important mountain in their history. It's where the Ten Commandments came from. It was a very important mountain in Israel history. The Mountain of God is what they would have called it then, right? So there he came to the cave and he spent the night. The cure for depression isn't always an easy one. In fact, sometimes it's not a cure in your life. Sometimes it's a splinter in your life that's not going to go away. Sometimes, like Paul had, a thorn in the flesh, an experience that wasn't going to go away, something we have to deal with, not something that we just get removed at the beckoning and request of God. Sometimes you need to talk it out. You need to give it over to God. You need to engage a counselor or medication. In Elijah's case, his simple solution was a nap, a snack, and a purpose. That's what he needed. The fact is, depression doesn't always make logical sense. For Elijah, he had just called down fire and water from heaven. And he's worried about some queen trying to kill him. Elijah's so focused on the negative that the people of God didn't turn to him the way that he wanted them to, the way he thought they should, even though he had done what God asked him to do. His faith is slowly restored as he eats this food and drinks this water that God gave him. He takes a nap, and an angel wakes him up twice for that, right? To give him what I believe is not just regular provision, but God's provision. Because I can't help but think that there was more to food and water and sleep. There's a meme traveling around on social media that says sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is have a nap and have a snack and take a nap, right? And that may be true. But here's what I believe was true for Elijah, and here's what I know was true for me, and what I believe is true for those of us that may deal with depressive thoughts. It's not just about a nap and a snack. It's about the source of the supply that really matters. It's the source of the nap. It's the source of the snack. It's the source of the rest, the source of the sustenance. It's the source that really matters. It's the source of the supply that really matters. And that's what we're going to find as we look into a really practical section of this conversation. How do I actually get through? How do I finally get through depression, depressive thoughts? How do I conquer it? So I'll tell you, for me, a few years back, I found myself in some mental trouble. We'll use that word. I'm a person that's incredibly driven, and I get up early, I work long hours, I work late, and I like that. That's just how I'm wired. Not everybody's that way. I'm wired that way. In this scenario, several years back, I found myself without the ability to get up early. I didn't have any drive. All I wanted to do was sleep. I had a perpetual negative attitude. I couldn't process stress in my life. It was stuck. I was restless. I felt worthless, helpless, isolated. The people I loved were hurt and I couldn't fix it. Decisions were made that were bad and I couldn't help it. You know, I felt a measure of uselessness. And so my wife one day came to me, and after dealing with this for a number of weeks or months, however long it'd been, longer than I can certainly imagine, and she looked at me and she said, "Kenny, I think you're depressed. You need to talk to somebody." And it began a journey for me that whatever I had accomplished in my life, at whatever age, nothing was ever going to be enough. That for me, because of who I was wired to always perpetually feel useless, worthless, like a failure. And no matter how much I did, right? And you know people wired this way. Some people, it's money, right? They never have enough, no matter how much they have. And so, you know, her response to me was very godly. I don't know that I responded particularly well. But after a while of beckoning and arguing and pushing, you know, I had a conversation with a counselor. And I've never been opposed to counseling. My wife and I, when we got married, I tell this story, you know, we were married 6 months before we entered marriage counseling. And we've never got out 12 years later. And we treat marriage counseling like a spiritual checkup in our life. We want to make sure everything is good, like we would a physical at the doctor. And so I'm not opposed to counseling, but I thought, I don't need that. I don't believe depression is real. And I discovered through both studying the scripture and reading around medicine that it is very real. And so I found two responses for me that were helpful. I want to share them with you really briefly. Two kinds of responses, I guess. The first is a biological response. For me, that meant getting help from a professional who can help me process the why. For me, it looked like reflection, meditation. There's an app that's free you can download called Abide, A-B-I-D-E, Abide. You can download Abide, and it will literally help you reflect on the scripture. And for me, that was the solution. I'm not opposed to medication. I've told you that. I didn't need that. I needed God's power and source and supply in my life. For me, it looked like diving deep in this biological response, diving deep into my past, not to uncover unhealed, painful wounds, though that may be the case for some. But for me, it was about understanding me, understanding my wiring. I'm naturally wired for depressive thoughts, and I have a routine, a staples in my life that keep me from walking down that path now of the depression progression. It keeps and leads me to really my spiritual response. Because in my spiritual response, for me, it was a deep dive into spiritual disciplines. And that looked like understanding the source of my supply. Because it's the source of the supply that matters. If you're going through depression, if you're dealing with depressive thoughts, finding help in a non-spiritual sense may provide a Band-Aid, but I anticipate if you're a follower of Christ, it's not going to provide a solution in a lot of cases. Especially if your depression is sourced in the spiritual issues. So it's the source of our supply that matters. And for me, it meant talking to a Christian counselor, talking to someone who could help me understand. The source of the supply is what mattered for Elijah. He wasn't hungry, he wasn't thirsty, he wasn't dying of those things, but God provided a supply that changed him, rest that changed him. For me, it was about God replacing my lies with his truth and understanding that failure isn't a person, it's an event. Failure is not a person, it's an event. I wasn't a failure, but I've failed at things. I failed at things this week that frustrated me and was to internalize that and make that into a person. But failure's not a person, it's an event. And so Elijah dealt with this as well. If we look back into 1 Kings, God replaced his lies with truth. He said, go stand before me on the mountain, the Lord told him. And Elijah stood there. And the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm came across the mountain. And it was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord wasn't in that wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord wasn't in that earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord wasn't in that fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. I can't help but believe that it was the gentle whisper, the whisper of God in his life and maybe in your life. That's the source of supply for replacing those lies to become truths in your mind. God's capable of the big show, the fire, the rain, but he's capable and loving enough to minister to you quietly in your home, in your garage, in your car, in your workplace. The third thing for me in the spiritual response was God renewed my purpose and pointed me in the direction of understanding that obedience is my responsibility and not result. He did this for Elijah as well. For me, it was quit focusing on what I've done and focus more on who I am in relationship to Jesus, because it's who Jesus says I am that matters, right? God restored Elijah. He sent him on his next mission. So, here's what I want to leave you with. You can manage this. If you're a person dealing with depression, if you're a person struggling with depressive thoughts, you can manage this. If you're a follower of Christ, you have everything you need to handle it. The power of the Holy Spirit rests in you and will provide you guidance towards the solution that's best for you. As long as you'll realize it's the source of your supply that matters. Today, I still battle depressive thoughts. I told you this week I had a failure in my life, and I was like, man, I'm an idiot, right? No, I had a failed event. I'm not a failure. I'm a son of God because Jesus gave his life for me. And the second piece of this is you can help others who are stuck by asking and listening and caring and not treating them like lepers, but recognizing that maybe they're dealing with something real. You can pray with them. You can step into their life and walk with them through a difficult circumstance. Wherever you're at on the spectrum, I encourage you, depression can be handled. The Spirit of God and the power of the power he possesses in you can provide solution. So today, I want to encourage you to take that step and engage his solution for your life.